we do have a problem of investor apathy in Hong Kong. The bulk of the shareholding population is really not interested in the way in which the companies in which they have invested are run. They are certainly interested in the way in which their investments go up and down, but they do not really make a connection between the operation and the way the company is managed and the state of their investments. And so we do have this, I think, big problem of essential shareholder apathy. This problem of shareholder apathy is also compounded by the fact that at the moment it is extremely difficult for the beneficial shareholders of shares in Hong Kong companies to take action in the context of AGM or the EGMs of those companies, because the legal owner of these shares is usually an intermediary or a series of intermediaries under the CCAS structure. And unless the beneficial shareholder has entered into a contractual understanding with the relevant intermediary or intermediaries, it is extremely difficult for he or she to get information about the company's AGMs, etc., and as a result turn up and make their voice heard at these meetings. This is not a problem unique to Hong Kong. It's a problem being experienced in other major jurisdictions which have switched to electronic trading in shares, and where the bulk of the shares are legally held by an intermediary. The UK is proposing various measures to deal with this in the context of its latest proposals on company law reform, and we will certainly be looking at this issue in the context of the rewrite of the Companies Ordinance. However, enfranchising shareholders is one thing, and making them more willing to exercise their rights is a completely different matter. And in this respect, there is a lot of work still to be done. We do have people like David Webb in Hong Kong who are prepared to turn up at company AGMs and make their voices heard, but they are very, very few and far between. Several years ago, as I think you know, David proposed the setting up of a body to be known as the Hong Kong Association of Minority Shareholders, or HAMS. For various reasons, this was not supported and didn't proceed. And indeed, if you look at other jurisdictions where you have similar bodies which purport to support minority shareholder action, they have not been that effective. Another area where you could possibly get greater shareholder investment is through the institutional investors who do hold increasing shareholdings in Hong Kong companies. Institutional investors do play a very key role in enhancing good corporate governance standards in major jurisdictions like the UK and the USA, and this is an area which I think we need to really try and push in Hong Kong.
I would say that my greatest regret in the corporate governance seal is the lack of institutional investor support. They are very quiet. If one looks to our usual markets, the UK and the US, in the US, some of the institutional investors, CalPERS is one which springs to mind, but they're by no means the only one, were leading the issue on governance. In the UK, it has been driven partly by the private sector. There's also been, there are two institutional bodies in the UK, one which represents the pension fund investors and one of which represents the fund managers. And they have had a lot of influence. I understand that if quite often when things are being put forward and new novel ideas, they don't ask their lawyers, is this in accordance with the rules and regulations? They say, will it pass the muster of these institutions? Because if those institutions recommend to their members that they're going to reject something, it's not going to fly. We don't have that at all in Hong Kong. I'm not saying we need that sort of regulatory authority, but we haven't had the pressures from the institutional investors.
One of the things that may be holding the development of corporate governance back in Hong Kong, I think, is the absence of institutional shareholder pressure. In other markets, in the US, in the UK, a lot of the corporate governance practices that are implemented are often in response to investor pressure. This can be institutions, fund managers, insurance companies, which actually result in certain practices being followed, which may not necessarily be laid down by regulation, but is what the market expects. And at that, we don't really see that in Hong Kong to a great extent. It may come with MPF as that becomes a bigger and bigger pool of money, but I think that to me has been really the surprising aspect. I don't think we see very much vocal activism, obviously with one or two exceptions.
Corporate governance elsewhere in the world has been forced on companies because of a scarcity of capital that requires investors to give, the demands the investors will make means that you have to up your game. Hong Kong companies have not been short of capital. This market is not short of capital in the way they were 20, 30 years ago. I mean, the big growth numbers of China mean that you can still come in here and you can issue paper at fairly high multiples, and so you can get away with stuff. So there is not, against that backdrop, I think it is hard often to push through painful reforms. And I frankly think we're seeing that a bit at the moment. The last couple of years has been pretty good compared to where we were in 2003. And I think there has undoubtedly been a bit of a backsliding in terms of the desire to push through painful change against is not in the interests of certain powerful vested interests in Hong Kong, specifically looking at in terms of the listening rules, defining powers of the SFC, looking at the role of the chairman of the SFC, things like that. I don't see quite the vim and vigour that there was a couple of years ago.
The local investors, the Hong Kong investors, getting more sophisticated. Certainly, I would say that in the 70s and the 80s, there was a great element of speculation, a greater element of speculation in the market. But now I think, with the MPF coming in, with the increasing sophistication of even and a rising middle class awareness of investments, I think equity investments has become a part of a lot of the people of Hong Kong. And as a result, I think the standards that they know and understand about also is there. I think most ordinary Hong Kong investors would hesitate buying shares in companies where they don't understand the background. I think, there are very few who consciously go for the speculative part of it. I don't dismiss that there are some investors like that, or some investors with a part of their portfolio who don't mind taking some risk. But I would say in general, people who look at investment as a nest egg, as a place where they want to preserve whatever wealth they've accumulated, is very cognizant and very conscious of corporate governance, and consciously look for that in the companies they invest in.